Good to go.
All right, thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go through some quick housekeeping remarks, and then we'll get on to the rest of the meeting today. So thank you for participating in our virtual advisory group meeting. We will do our best to facilitate a smooth meeting with public participation. We have two formats for participation, the Zoom web application as well as teleconference. Before we begin, I want to review some guidelines and general instructions for the meeting. Please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone. This will ensure that we are not hearing any feedback or causing interruption during the meeting. All participants on Zoom, except for advisory group members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each agenda item, we will open up for discussion by the advisory group and public comment. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note you can hang up or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. We ask that you please adhere to any speaker limits and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. And finally, I do see that there's a nice robust list of attendees. If there are any attendees who are advisory group members, please raise your hand so we can bring you over to the panel. And the same, I'll ask if there are any board members or board member assistants who would also like to be promoted to the panel. Please raise your hand as well and we'll bring you over. With that, that concludes housekeeping remarks, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Reese.
Morning, everybody. Happy Friday, and thank you for attending our AQMP advisory group meeting. We have a packed agenda and a lot of good discussion topics today, so we want to get right to that. But before we start, just want to introduce staff real quick. So I'm Sarah Reese. I'm Deputy Executive Officer for Planning at South Coast. I'm just going to go around the room as I see people to introduce them. So Sang-mi, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. I'm Sang-mi Lee. I'm Planning and Rules Manager overseeing AQMP development. Thank you.
Ian?
Ian McMillan, Assistant Deputy under Sarah.
Kalam?
Good morning. This is Kalam Chang, Program Supervisor at Planning and Rules.
Catherine?
Morning. Catherine Roberts, an attorney in the General Counsel's Office.
Kraus?
Mike Kraus, Assistant Deputy Executive Officer under Sarah.
And Jong.
Morning, everyone. This is Jong-Hoon Lee in South Coast AQMD Planning and Rules Division.
So I think with that, I have everybody from the district. Before we start, I want to seek approval of minutes from the last meeting that we had. So unless I hear any other comments to the contrary, we will proceed with that. And with that, I think we can start our agenda. So moving on to item number 2, Kalam is going to give us a presentation on preliminary results of our 2022 AQMP RACT demonstration. Go ahead, Kalam.
Thank you, Sarah. So let's begin. Next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar, recently available control measures, RACO is a requirement under the Federal Clean Air Act, is applicable for ozone non-attainment area, and is due the same time as part of the attainment plan. Measures must be adopted if they meet the following 3 criteria. One is that they're technologically feasible. Second is that they're economically feasible. And third is that the measures will either advance attainment date by 1 year, or they're necessary for reasonable further progress, which is also known as RFP. RFP for ozone is defined as roughly equivalent to a 3% annual reductions of either volatile organic compounds, VOC, or NOx, nitrogen oxides. RACO applies to both stationary as well as mobile sources. And the purpose of RACO is to demonstrate that non-attainment areas has adopted all reasonably available control measures. Next slide, please. So I'm on slide number 3 here, and this slide shows the overall approach of our RACO demonstration for stationary sources. We have like 3 stages of analysis. The first stage is essentially a research stage, which we try to identify potential RACO through a very robust and comprehensive analysis. So all the potential RACO that we identified from stage 1 will proceed to stage 2, which will delve in to do a more detailed feasibility analysis on both checking to see if they're either technologically feasible to implement or cost effective to implement. And the last stage is stage 3. For all the RACO, we'll evaluate whether these emission reductions are needed for either the RFP or if they're needed to advance attainment. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a more detailed breakdown of what we do on stage 1 of this process. Stage 1 includes a 7-step analysis for stationary sources. We provide a lot more details in one of the prior advisory groups, so I'm not going to go into details here. But in brief, there are 7 overall source of information that we look at. We look at the rules and regulations as well as control measures that have been adopted or are being implemented in other areas, both within California and in other states. On top, we evaluate technical support documents, manual of control measures, guidance documents that are released by the US EPA. Control measures workshop and other working group meetings are also a way of information that we will consider. Next slide, please. So based on the research and comprehensive analysis that we did for stage 1, we've identified 7 potential RACO. The 7 RACOs are listed here as a table, but I'll go into detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So here we moved on to the stage 2 of the RACO demonstration, where we do a very detailed feasibility analysis of all the potential RACOs that are being identified. So I'm on slide number 6 here, and this potential RACO number 1, it targets NOx emission reductions for boilers, steam generators, and process heaters. This source category is subject to South Coast AQMD Rule 1146. And as you can see from the table on top, the NOx emission limits in our rule is not as stringent as the NOx emission limits that are listed in San Joaquin's rule for boilers that are between 5 and 20 million BTU per hour. So we moved on to look at the technological feasibility to implement the emission limits in San Joaquin's rule. NOx limits at 5 ppm or below, they're feasible, and they'll likely require the installation of selective catalyst reduction, SCR. There are several technological limitations associated with retrofitting existing units with SCR, including the age, flow, and size of the catalyst bed, as well as the potential higher ammonia emissions. So it's well known that if we lower the NOx emissions, there's a possibility that there will be higher ammonia emissions, also known as ammonia slip. And in San Joaquin Valley's rule, in their staff report, they've also identified that the limits listed in their rule, they're technologically forcing limits. And in that rule, there are 2 ways to comply. One is to retrofit an existing unit to meet the emission limits listed in the rule. And second is to comply through a mitigation fee option. So staff looked at the implementation of San Joaquin's rule. It turns out that only very few units of their universe are retrofitting to meet the NOx emission limits. And that's why, based on that analysis, staff is concluding that currently, based on the current information available, it is not technologically feasible to implement the NOx emission limit in San Joaquin's rule, but we'll continue to evaluate feasibility. And we do plan to address emissions from this source category as part of the control measure of this AQMP under LCMBO2. Next slide, please. Potential RACO number 2 it addresses emissions from cooling towers. In the last couple of years, Bay Area has amended a rule that have more stringent leak monitoring requirements, as well as more stringent leak repair time compared to the facilities that are subject to these requirements in our basin. In terms of technologically feasibility, an increase in monitoring frequency is definitely feasible. Additional leak requirements could be feasible as well. So we move on to look at the economic feasibility. And the cost, of course, it varies depending on the frequency of the required monitoring and the time that is allowed to repair the leak. When we look at emissions from refineries, fugitive emissions are mostly from storage tanks, which are currently regulated under South Coast Rule 1178. And we proceed to look at emissions from cooling towers specifically. And it turns out that these VOC fugitive emissions from cooling towers, they vary very widely from year to year, as well as facility to facility. The emissions could range from less than 0.1 tons to about 0.8 tons per day from the refineries that were reporting to us in the last couple of years. So it is relatively difficult to determine potential emission reductions, and we plan to address emissions from fugitive emissions from cooling towers as part of control measure FUG-02. Next slide, please. Potential RACO number 3, it addresses NOx emissions from commercial food ovens. This source category is subject to South Coast Rule 1153.1. And San Joaquin, it has a rule that has a lower NOx emission limit for ovens, but currently their food ovens are exempt from that rule. We're looking at technologically feasibility and economic feasibility. And currently Rule 1153.1 is under amendment as part of the reclaim transition. We're going to determine feasibility as part of this amendment, as the amendment will determine the BART emission limit for this source category, which represent the best available retrofit control technology. This rule is scheduled, we already have a first working group meeting last year, and this rule is scheduled for board consideration in the summer fall timeframe of this year. Next slide, please. Potential RACO number 4 targets energy use in existing residential buildings. There are 2 ways to reduce energy use in existing buildings. One is to implement energy efficient residential appliances. Examples include heat pump water heaters, as well as heat pumps space heaters. So currently these products are available and commercially available on the shelf. The second way to reduce energy use is through better insulation. So better insulation of our households means that we could potentially reduce the energy used from either heating or cooling the house. Because it's technologically feasible to implement such measures, we move on to look at the economic feasibility. The implementation cost of this idea of this measure, it varies very widely depending on the equipment that we're trying to replace, as well as the existing infrastructure of buildings. It turns out that there are a couple of scenarios where it could be cost effective. One scenario is that when one is replacing both of their space heating and air conditioning unit with heat pump, the heat pump could both heat and cool a unit, and that's why there could be potential cost savings. The second scenario is when there are incentives available that could lower the upfront incremental cost, which includes the upfront incremental equipment costs, and usually energy efficient appliances are more expensive than their conventional counterparts. There could be also incentives that are available to help lower or offset the infrastructure upgrades that could potentially be needed. Because of the variability of cost, we plan to address emissions from residential buildings through the control measures in our residential combustion series, as well as in energy and climate change control measure. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 10 here, and for potential RACO number 5, it addresses VOC emissions from gasoline bulk terminals. Currently, this source category is subject to South Coast Rule 462. It has a VOC limit at 0.08 pounds per 1,000 gallons of liquid loaded. It is less stringent compared to the limit in a rule in Bay Area. In terms of technologically feasibility, vapor recovery technology is available and currently achieved in practice. So we moved on to look at the economic feasibility. The inventory, the baseline inventory for this source category is at about 0.3 tons per day from all the terminals that are subject to the rule. And the emission rates for most of these facilities are reported already below the lower VOC limit that are listed in Bay Area's rule. Considering a minor modification that could be needed per terminal, and because of the relatively low emission inventory, the cost effectiveness is over $250,000 per ton. And we're concluding that it's not cost effective to implement this potential RACO. Next slide, please. This slide looks at potential emission reductions from auto and light duty truck assembly lines. Currently, this source category is subject to South Coast Rule 1115. And there are several subcategories in that rule that have less stringent limits compared to a control technique guidelines that were released by the US EPA in 2008. We look at technologically feasibility, and it is considered feasible to meet the emissions limit that are listed in the CTG. We've paid visits to all the facilities that are subject to the rule, and it turns out that the operators are already using coatings that would meet the proposed lower VOC emission limits. So we're concluding that it is both technologically feasible and cost effective to implement this potential RACO. And currently 1115 amendment is underway, and it is scheduled to go to our board in March of this year. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 12, and potential RACO number 7 looks at VOC emissions from metal container closure and coil coating operations. There are about 20 categories of VOC emissions limits that are listed in the rule. And there are 2 out of that 20 categories that have VOC limits that are less stringent than those that are required in other non-attainment areas. So we look at the technologically feasibility to implement the lower emission limits. And it turns out that these lower VOC content reformulations, they do exist. And there are other districts who've identified the known uses of these lower content reformulations. Then we moved on to look at the economic feasibility. And the 2018 baseline inventory for these 2 subcategories, they're very low at 0.007 tons per day of VOC emissions. Because there will be costs associated to implement the testing and transition of using these lower content reformulations, and the very small inventory associated with these 2 subcategories, the cost effectiveness is around $260,000 per ton of VOC reduction. So we're concluding that it's not cost effective to implement this potential RACO. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 13 here, and this slide shows a summary of our preliminary results of the RACO analysis. Again, we've identified 7 potential RACO from stage 1, a comprehensive research of all the potential RACO. And then in stage 2, we look at both the technological and economic feasibility. And this table also lists the actions that we plan to take to address emissions from these source categories. Because if we look at potential RACO number 6, that's the only potential RACO that is deemed both technologically and economic feasible. And the amendment, the action that we're taking is we're amending Rule 1115 to address the potential discrepancy between our emission limit and the emission limit that are listed in the control technique guidelines in the US EPA guidance. So the amendment is already underway, and it will be going to the board in March of this year. For the other remaining 6 potential RACOs, there are some feasibility issues, and we will continue to monitor and assess feasibility. And a lot of these potential RACOMs, we do plan to address their emissions as part of the control measures of this AQMP. Next slide, please. In terms of next step, we are soliciting input from stakeholders. So if you have any comments and suggestions of our RACOM demonstrations, please let us know. And another thing that we will plan to do for the RACOM demonstration is that we are going to determine whether these emission reductions are needed for either RFP requirements or if they could advance attainment by 1 year. Recall that there are 3 stages of the analysis. Then today we touch base on stage 1 as well as stage 2. And for stage 3, because our attainment scenario is under evaluation, it will be available in the next couple of weeks, where we will then be able to determine the level of emission reductions are needed for RFP or to advance attainment. And finally, we do plan to release the draft RACOM demonstration as part of the draft AQMP. And that way we'll have a formal public review process as part of the draft AQMP release. With that, I conclude my presentation on the RACOM demonstration, and I'm happy to take any comments or suggestions or questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Kalam. Just really quick, I'll also make this announcement again. If there are any attendees who are advisory group members and wish to be put on the panel, please raise your hand and we'll make sure to bring you over to the panel. Right now, we do want to open this up for discussion with the advisory group. I do see that we have a hand raised. So let's see, Adrian Martinez, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It's very informative. I've got a question about whether, as part of this analysis, you'll be looking at New Jersey's, it's not a final rule, but a proposed rule around boilers, and whether that will be part of the analysis, because it seems like they are looking to advance zero emissions and boilers, and it also may be kind of able to address some of the ammonia issues that you raised earlier. But I just wanted to see if that will be part of this analysis or some other analysis in the AQMP.
First, thank you for the heads up. And we do look at rules and regulations that are being adopted in other areas. So as you mentioned, this is a proposed rule, so it probably wasn't under our radar when we did the analysis. But now that you bring it up, we could definitely take a look into it and look at the requirements and their approach to reduce emissions from boilers. And as part of the analysis, we'll definitely look at feasibility and cost effectiveness. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Any other questions or comments from the advisory group? And then again, I will say, feel free to hit the raise hand button or *9 if you're calling in. I don't see any hands raised from the advisory group. Oh, I do see one. Lakshmi, do you have a question or comment?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I'm actually speaking on behalf of Southern California Gas Company. My comment here is related to RACOM 4, which is additional enhancement in reducing existing residential building energy use. Staff developed the NEED tool in 2018 to evaluate the cost effectiveness of residential appliance replacement options within the South Coast Air Basin. My team has performed some model runs using the NEED tool for electrification of the residential space heaters. We found that the cost effectiveness ranged from $360,000 to $460,000 per ton of NOx reduced. And these values are 7 to 9 times less cost effective than the 2016 AQMP cost effectiveness threshold of $50,000 per ton. When we did a similar analysis for electrification of water heaters, it indicated that cost effectiveness for some homes could approach $3.5 million per ton of NOx, which is 70 times less cost effective than the $50,000 per ton of NOx. So if a goal here is to sort of reduce the cost barriers for electrical appliances. I think an incentive-based approach, similar to what Kalham described in the presentation earlier today, and what you pursued in the 2016 AQMP, rather than regulatory requirements, is the appropriate path forward. We believe that the 2022 AQMP building control measures should include a pathway for all near zero emission technologies, like natural gas heat pumps, dual fuel systems, lower natural gas furnaces, fuel cell heaters, gas heat pump water heaters. The 2016 AQMP estimated the cost effectiveness for these types of technologies to be between $15,000 to $30,000 per ton of NOx. I'm happy to discuss the details of our analysis with staff, and I'll also be submitting a written comment letter summarizing these findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi, for your comments. And we do recognize that the cost of implementing energy efficiency control measures in the residential building sectors, it varies a lot. And it's not a surprise because look at our housing stock, like there are older homes or newer homes, and there are homes that need infrastructure upgrades to accommodate the changes, and there are homes that might not need as much infrastructure upgrades. So from staff's analysis, we do realize that there are a range of cost effectiveness. And that's why I think it's more appropriate to look at it into more details as part of the control measures, so that staff could dive into these category per category and look at the cost effectiveness in different scenarios.
Thanks, Kalam. And we have also, like I mentioned, we have done some analysis. We'll share that with you. We are happy to work with staff as you develop these control measures.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. Looking forward to receiving that analysis too. See, Adrian, do you have your hand raised again?
Yes, I just would like to respond to that last comment, just to make clear that there are groups in the advisory group that prefer a regulatory path as opposed to voluntary incentive-based paths for several types of the technologies. And so I just want to make clear that that wasn't reflective of everyone on the committee. And we think actually there is a room for regulation for a large portion of these types of categories, given the need to get to zero emissions and the amount of emissions reductions that's necessary, based on the November presentation that staff gave.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Do we see, or do we have any other comments or questions from the advisory group? Seeing none right now, let's go ahead and turn to hands that are raised from attendees. So I see first, Mark Abramowitz, you have your hand raised. Maybe we can ask Mark to unmute and hear his comments or questions.
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much. I have two questions. One is that
looks like you're back on mute.
I'm sorry. I thought I was unmuted. Thank you very much again. I have two questions. One is that for some of those measures, the district indicated that it wasn't cost effective, and while some of those seem to be fairly expensive, what's the metric against which you are determining cost effectiveness? Is the district looking at new numbers this time? And if I could point out that the Clean Air Act doesn't refer to cost effectiveness. I think it refers to economic and technological feasibility, which may be different than cost effectiveness. I can ask my second question first, if you like.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
One of the slides showed that RACO requires that it show a 1 year or more advancement in reaching attainment. And I'm just wondering where that came from. Is that some sort of a new provision or requirement? I don't recall seeing that language in the Clean Air Act for over 40 years now.
Maybe Kalam, do you want to address that second question, and then we'll circle back to the first question?
Definitely. So regarding the second part of your question, how do we determine whether measures have to be considered as RACO? It is under, I believe it's under the EPA's implementation rules that RACO measures have to be either help with the needed for the RFP requirements, or if they could help advance attainment by 1 year. So it's probably not explicitly listed in the Clean Air Act, but it is under EPA's implementation rule of guidance. So I can definitely send you documents or references that are related to that provisions offline.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then to your first question about cost effectiveness, I think you were referring to the 2016 AQMP, where there was some description about, and I think this was also referred from Lakshmi, our previous commenter, referring to a $50,000 per ton level that was discussed in the 2016 AQMP. But how that was discussed in that AQMP was that if there were measures that were above that threshold, when you get to later rulemaking, for example, that would just trigger additional analysis and an additional process to work through and dive in a little bit more on that cost effectiveness approach. And I don't think we've determined yet for this AQMP what exactly that would look like, if that same exact approach of set a number and which requires additional analysis. There's, I think, a lot of good reasons to keep going that route. But then what would that number be? I don't think we've actually gone through that just yet. It's a good question you're raising there, Mark. But I don't think we have that just yet. I think some of what was shown on these slides were some, when there's discussion about if something is or is not cost effective, I think those were for fairly high numbers that are well beyond anything that was discussed in the 2016 AQMP. But I don't think we have made any firm determinations about what would go into the draft AQMP at this stage just yet.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah. I see another hand raised from the attendees, Frances Keeler. Can we ask her to unmute?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the presentation. And as we all push for cleaner technologies and push towards zero emissions, I wanted to make sure, or at least comment that we want to make sure the district is looking at the availability of reliable infrastructure as we push those technologies forward. So I'm hoping that that will be part of that analysis. What we want to make sure is we don't go to all electric and then don't have sufficient electricity to support those technologies. So I think that's an important element of the analysis. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I'll take that one. Great comment there, Frances. We do, in fact, also have a separate working group process set up specifically on zero emissions infrastructure. A lot of that is teeing up some of the same kinds of challenges on the transportation sector, but it certainly applies if there's much more widespread electrification into the stationary or area sources. And so we are trying to address a lot of those questions in that working group process as well. Certainly, the issues of the grid are not something that can be fully addressed by AQMD. There are many other agencies and entities involved, but we are trying to make sure to explore that issue and develop a work plan for what our agency would do as part of that as we develop the various measures that we have. So certainly encourage people to attend or provide their feedback as part of that working group. Definitely a good point that you're raising that we're trying to explore.
And that's understood, and it is actually a statewide issue because everyone, CARB and all the other districts, as well as South Coast, are pushing for that zero and even hydrogen in that. We want to make sure we have that infrastructure in place to support those technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, great, good comment. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised from attendees. So let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. And so I got to get back to my agenda here. We have, I'm lucky to have somebody here from CARB. Moni, if you can move on to the motor vehicle emissions budget, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Ian.
Great.
Good morning. Hope you can all hear me.
Yeah, you're coming in loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nesamani Kalandiu. You can call me Mani. I'm the manager of the Transportation Analysis section within the Sustainable Transportation and Communities divisions at CARB. My team is responsible for developing the motor vehicle emissions budgets for transportation conformity. Today, I'll be presenting the process of developing the motor vehicle emissions budget in the SIP. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows the outline. First, I'll provide a brief overview of transportation conformity and motor vehicle emissions budget. Then I'll discuss types of SIPs with motor vehicle emissions budget and tools used for developing them. Then I'll go through the interagency consultation and adequacy determination processes. Finally, I'll discuss the applications of motor vehicles emissions budget. Yeah, next slide, please. This slide provides background about transportation conformity. As you may know, the purpose of transportation conformity is to link and coordinate the region's transportation and air quality planning processes. The chart on the right illustrates this point clearly. A motor vehicle emission budget is established as part of the state implementation plan. The purpose is to ensure that the transportation activities do not cause or contribute any new air quality violations, or increase the frequency of existing violations, or delay the timely implementation of national ambient air quality standards. Next slide, please. Yeah, this slide shows or discusses what's included in a motor vehicle emissions budget. And motor vehicle emissions budget is the total allowable emissions from on-road mobile sources such as cars, trucks, and buses. The chart on the right shows different emission sources considered in SIP, in the state implementation plan. The motor vehicle emissions budget covers just one part of the emissions pie in the SIP, that is the on-road emissions. The pie on the green color, that's what it's covered under the motor vehicle emissions budget. In other words, the budget serves as a regulatory limit for on-road mobile source emissions in SIP. As designated under federal and state law, the motor vehicle emissions budgets are calculated by CARB based on emissions inventory and control measures in the SIP. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 5, just those who are on the phone. This slide discusses various pollutants and precursors included in the budgets. Conformity applies to both direct and precursor pollutants. For example, in ozone SIPs, budgets are based on precursors of VOC and NOx emissions. For PM10 and PM2.5 plants, in addition to VOC and NOx precursors, it must also include motor vehicle emissions from tailpipe, brake wear, and tire wear. Further, it includes road dust from paved and unpaved road travel activities, and also construction dust from highways and transit-related construction activities. For the PM2.5 plants, additionally, ammonia and sulfur dioxide is also included if these precursors are found to be significant contributor to the PM2.5 formation itself. Next slide, please. This slide shows different types of SIPs with the motor vehicle emissions budget. From the motor vehicle emissions budget perspective, the control strategy implementation plan, also known as the attainment plan, and the maintenance plan are the two critical SIPs. The budgets are established for RFP years and attainment year for ozone standard. If the plan is for PM2.5, then we must also include budgets for the post-attainment year as well. For all maintenance plans, it must include budgets for the last year of the maintenance plan. The maximum cap between the two budget years should not be more than 10 years. That's the requirement here. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 7. This slide discusses tools used for developing motor vehicle emissions budget. The most recent USEP approved emission factor model is MFAC 2017 for SIP and transportation conformity purposes. Although MFAC 2021 is now pending approval USEPA, they are reviewing the MFAC 2021 model as we speak. It provides the latest information on vehicle registration, age, fleet mix, and control measures such as I&M program, vehicle technologies, and fuels. Those are the information comes from the MFAC model. On the other hand, MPO provides BMT and speed using network-based demand modeling with the most recent assumptions regarding transportation demand, such as human population, employment, travel cost, and congestion in the region. According to FHW recommendation, planning assumptions should be regularly updated or at least every 5 years. If planning assumptions are older than 5 years, return justification should be provided as part of the SIP. To meet this recommendation, CARB updates the MFAC model approximately every 3 years. Next slide, please. This slide shows the importance of interagency consultation process. It allows collaboration and discussion of methodology and key assumptions among different agencies. In addition, it helps to identify critical issues early in the process. For example, this allows collaborative decisions related to assumptions in travel demand forecasting model or emissions modeling. The Transportation Conformity Working Group meets every month to facilitate the discussion in the Southern California. It also organized by SCAG actually. So it meets, SCAG is the leading agency organizing this working group meeting. The general participants are staffs from FHWA, FTA, and USEP at the federal level, from the state, CARB and Caltrans, and at the regional and local level, it includes SCAG, South Coast AQMD, and some local transportation and transit agencies. Next slide, please. This slide discusses adequacy determination. It requires that the proposed budget in SIP are determined adequate or approved before transportation agencies can use them to demonstrate the budget. I'll provide more information about the adequacy process in the next couple of slides, but it is different from the completeness finding on a SIP. Please also note that the adequacy finding of a motor vehicle emissions budget does not guarantee the approval of a SIP. Next slide, please. I'm on slide number 10 here. This slide discusses the criteria for determining adequacy. The motor vehicle emissions budget is considered adequate if it is clearly identified, quantified, and understood by all parties involved. It must also be consistent with the total emissions inventory and control measures included in the SIP. In addition, it must be consistent with requirements of RFP, attainment, or maintenance demonstration. Finally, if budgets are revised, they should be clearly explained and document the reasons for the change. Next slide, please. This slide gives an overview of the adequacy process itself. Generally, the adequacy determination process takes about 90 days to complete the whole process. As part of this, the first step is CARB board approves the SIP and sends it to USEPA. Once USEPA receives it, then they announce the receipt of the SIP on the OTAC website, that is the Office of Transportation and Air Quality website, to initiate a 30-day public comment period. In California, the USEPA Region 9 office determines whether the MVB submitted in the SIP is adequate. As part of this process, USEPA staff responds to any comments that it has been received and sends a letter about its determination as well. Finally, USEPA issues the Federal Register notice and posts it on the OTAC website. It becomes effective 15 days from the Federal Register notice is published. Next slide, please. Once USEPA determines the budgets are adequate or approved, MPOs are required to demonstrate that the emissions projected from the Regional Transportation Plan and Transportation Improvement Program do not exceed the motor vehicle emissions budget within 24 months. MPOs must also demonstrate conformity at least every 4 years when they adopt long-range regional transportation plan or transportation improvement programs. It may happen more frequently when MPOs amend their RTP or TIP and federal transportation projects. This will be discussed more in detail by Rongshang Luo from SCAG in his next presentation as well. Next slide, please. This is a summary slide. Just to summarize, the take-home message is that conformity ensures that both the transportation and area agencies collaborate continuously throughout the process. In addition, the budgets must be based on the latest planning assumptions and USCPA approved emission factor model. Finally, the MVB must be consistent with the emissions inventory, control measures, RFP, and attainment demonstration. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mani. So I do want to open this up again to see if there are any advisory group member comments or questions. I do see a hand raised. Janet Whittick, did you have something you wanted to share?
Oh, I had a question. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to better understand the differences between MFAC 2021 and MFAC the 2017 being used. And I get that for this, for the motor vehicle emissions budget, you need to use a SIP approved model. I think though, my question is, doesn't the mobile source strategy use the 2021 tool? And is there anything there about switching back and forth between the two different ones?
Yeah, for the conformity purposes, it must be approved by US EPA. Before that, we can't use the MFAC model. You're right, I think your understanding is right. The MFAC 2021 is on the street. It's been reviewed and it's under review by US EPA staff as well as we speak at this point. Until they determine it's approved for air quality purposes, we can't use it for conformity purposes. So
okay, so you can use 2021 for the plan at a high level, but you can't use it for conformity purposes.
No, even for the SIP purposes, we are not using MFAC 2021. We are using MFAC 2017. Even all the inventory, emissions inventory, everything is based on MFAC 2017.
But am I wrong then that the mobile source strategy uses 2021?
Yeah, Sylvia, do you want to jump in? Mobile source.
Sure. You know, Janet, you are correct. We did use for the mobile source strategy, it did use MFAC 2021. But what we're going to provide to South Coast as far as our emission reduction commitment is in the state SIP strategy. And because, MFAC 2017 is the basis for the SIP, all of our emission reduction strategies will be based on like an MFAC 2017 type currency. So the state SIP strategy with the draft that we came out with last October, the draft measures documents, and we're planning on coming out with another draft fairly shortly. All the emission reductions in that draft will be in an MFAC 2017 to be consistent with the attainment demonstration.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And just do you have a sense when EPA may approve the 2021 tool? Not that it would apply to what we're doing here, but just out of curiosity.
I think, yeah, they are under reviewing right now. So according to staff level communication, sometime in the next quarter, they're supposed to be working on it. So that's the indication. But again, they're going through their public process and everything. They can't put a specific date at this point.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, no problem. Welcome.
Great, thanks. So we see Adrian, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a helpful reminder of how this process works. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. I think what was discussed is kind of the agencies are going to look at what the control measures achieve and then base setting the budgets on that. I'm wondering, is there any kind of thought to how using the motor vehicle emissions budget itself as a way to drive down emissions with the understanding that actual infrastructure can be designed or choices on infrastructure could lead to significant, particularly NOx and VOC reductions. I was wondering, is there any kind of looking at that? Because I think, we're starting to understand a lot about our transportation choices and how we expand our system. And it seems like this is precisely the place where you could push for better transportation decisions.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that comment. We received a similar comment as well as part of our state SIP strategy measures that we released draft through the public workshop. We received a similar comment. We are looking into it a little more closely, and we are trying to understand the process as well and trying to look at the existing process and where we can develop that process itself. So that's what we are thinking right now. But we will have more information as we develop this budget development process itself. So that's where it is. But you're making a very good point. I think this is a process. We need to go through all the public process as well as the interagency consultation for developing that type of an approach.
Can I just one last question, just so I can understand the process? So when will the draft budgets be released, and will we have a comment period before the final package goes to the boards?
Yes, the budget will be included as part of the draft plan. Maybe I think I would like Sangmi or Kalam to respond to that particular timeline exactly, but it will be available for public comment period as well. Yep.
Yes, I can chime in. Draft release will be in kind of March timeframe. And then once draft is released, yes, there will be 45 days public comment period. So there will be sufficient time to accommodate public comments.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I see another hand raised, Paul Ryan. Paul, if you want to unmute yourself.
There I go.
There you go.
This is Paul Ryan representing CRRC. I had a general question in regard to the emission modeling. We go forward with the implementation of SB 1383 regarding the short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategies for organic waste reductions. We're finding that the heavy-duty refuse fleets are incurring additional vehicle miles traveled and vehicle trips to accommodate the requirements of the regulation, as well as we're incurring additional trips and mileage distances to satisfy the requirements for processing and delivery or transportation to various remote facilities. And so one of the things in looking at earlier modeling, it looked like the heavy duty refuse fleets didn't quite address some of the things that we're seeing occurring right now. And I was hoping that that would be a consideration as we go forward in the modeling.
Sure. By conformity regulations and by Clean Air Act, the motor vehicle emissions budget should be using the activity data. The transportation activity data comes from the recently adopted regional transportation plan. In this case, we are planning to use Connect SoCal that SCAG has adopted. That's the activity data. We are planning to use it for this budget development itself. Again, Rangshang Lu is here. You would be happy to expand that aspect of it. The activity data for the truck specifically you're referencing here, if the activity data is whatever is captured in that process, that's what we'll be able to use it here for developing the budget. We can't add a new activity data without going through that process. Until the SCAG board approves it, we can't use that. Rangshang, do you want to jump in and expand that?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rangshang Lu. I'm the manager of the environmental analysis business unit at SCAG. With regard to the VMT, yes, we have a process, a SCAG, as part of our plan development. And the VMT reflects all the VMT, throughout the region. Certainly applies to the trucks that you mentioned.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Any other comments or questions from the advisory group? Feel free to raise your hand. Don't see any right now. So I do see we have one hand raised from the attendees. So let's ask Naveen Berry. Looks like you have your hand raised. If you could unmute and share your thoughts, questions, comments.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's great to see everyone. It's been about a year for me now that I haven't been part of this screen on AQMP and other AQMD related matters. But this particular one, I was listening to Manny's presentation, and thank you very much for that background. So the question really is for Manny and or Sylvia. MFAC 17 doesn't really reflect some of the more recent studies that we've done on in-use emissions from heavy-duty trucks, especially Class 8 trucks. And it's not unknown that post-2010 trucks with SCR under low load or low temperature conditions really don't get the NOx reductions that were originally anticipated by the truck and bus regulation. So how is that being incorporated into the inventory that will be used for this particular AQMP?
Sure, I can start, and then I'm sure Sylvia would be happy to jump in and add more. So the inventory reflects that that we are using it for. It's already adjusted for the latest regulations that our board has adopted. So whatever the revisions has been made, that has been already incorporated, even though the model per se may not have done it, but as an off-model adjustments, we reflected that, and that's what it's reflected in the inventory. It's inventory that we are developing the SIP as well as the motor vehicle emissions budget. Sylvia, do you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, in fact, 2017 reflects a lot more real world conditions than the previous model, in fact, 2014. And that's really why, as you see, we continue to move on. And with Impact 2021, we're continuing to, update our understanding of emissions of the motor vehicle population. Any kind of regulations that we're going to reflect in the SIP are going to reflect any issues, that we're finding out, like, anything that you described. I'd have to actually talk to our staff that developed the mobile source emissions, to further answer this question. But my understanding is MFAC 2017 emissions are higher than the previous model, and that MFAC 2021 are more consistent with MFAC 2017. But as far as your detailed question, I don't have the answer, and luckily Michael's jumping on and he may have the answer. So
yes, I think we want to differentiate what we're sort of bound to under the terms of EPA approval of the MFAC model and what we can use for SIP purposes versus what CARB is doing in the real world. And we're well aware of these issues with low load NOx emissions. We've been doing a lot of work to measure those emissions and understand under what circumstances do they occur, developing appropriate test cycles, building those into our future rulemaking. And so even though it may not be reflected explicitly within the version of MFAC that is used for this SIP, that doesn't mean that CARB as an agency is not aware of the issue or that we're not taking actions to mitigate emissions from low load NOx operations.
So can I just follow up really quick on that, Naveen? I want to get to this point. I'm not sure if this is where you're going, but Michael, can you touch on, so there's the heavy duty I&M program, which I believe is going to be included as a control measure. And because that is in many respects meant to address this low load concern. Is that one place that this could also be addressed as far as looking at the emissions impact from low load and how that would be included in this AQMP?
Well, I think I want to be careful not to conflate heavy duty I&M with the low load NOx issue. The low load NOx problem is when we have vehicles that are operating at low speeds where the SCR doesn't get to a high enough temperature to mitigate the NOx emissions. Whereas the heavy duty I&M program is designed primarily to identify those vehicles who may have malfunctioning systems that need to be fixed. And so the first issue is really one that's more a function of vehicle design, whereas the second one is more one of vehicle malperformance or malfunction of control equipment. So I think what we're trying to do through our regulatory processes is to, let's just say, close some of the loopholes in terms of how the emissions testing and certification is done for some of these vehicles, heavy duty vehicles that are emitting higher than expected NOx under low load operating conditions. And obviously, I think that, CARB's overall strategy to move towards zero emissions and to move away from combustion is going to address this issue altogether.
So I guess I appreciate the discussion and the feedback, and I'd love to get some more details in that regard. My only concern is that we're going to continue to have these brand new diesel trucks that are still coming into the marketplace until 2027 when the standards drop again and the new testing protocols are implemented. Those are going to be in service for 15 years, and we're talking about a 2037 goal of 70 ppb. So it's really vital to understand how those emissions inventories, those baseline inventories, are going to be adjusted. Because if it's just based on what the truck and bus regulation was supposed to do, we're certainly not going to be accurate in that regard. So I just appreciate getting into a little more details, and would love some additional feedback either from ARB or AQMD staff. Thank you.
Great. We'll have to, I think, circle back a little bit on that issue, but a good one to raise, Naveen. It's certainly been a concern for a while, those emissions. So then I'll see if there are any other questions or comments from any attendees. I don't see any hands raised right now. So then I think with that, why don't we go ahead and move on to our next agenda item. And so this, I think this dovetails nicely with the previous, and we're going to be talking about some TCM. So Rongsheng, if you want to take us away.
Thank you, Ian. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Good morning, everyone again. My name is Rongsheng Luo. I'm the manager of SCAG's Environmental Analysis Business Unit. I will present an overview of transportation control measures, or TCMs, and how motor vehicle emission budgets are used. Next slide, please. My next 4 slides are general background information, so I will go over these slides fairly quickly. First, SCAG is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the 6-county Southern California region, which covers the entire South Coast AQMD jurisdiction. And SCAG is primarily responsible for developing the Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy, or RTP-SES, under the Federal Transportation Improvement Program, or FTIP, that implements the RTP-SES. And SCAG is also responsible for preparing a portion, commonly known as Appendix 4C of South Coast AQMD's AQMP, in addition to providing socio-economic data. Next slide, please. The RTP-SES is a long-range regional plan that's developed every 4 years, while the FTIP is the short-term transportation program that implements the RTP-SES and is developed every 2 years. And both the RTP-SES and the FTIP are required to demonstrate transportation conformity. Next slide, please. As mentioned by Nesmani earlier, transportation conformity really connects SCAG's transportation planning with the air quality planning. And specifically to demonstrate transportation conformity, SCAG's RTP and FTIP must meet 4 specific kind of conformity tests. The first test is the regional emissions analysis test. Specifically, emissions of our plan must meet all applicable motor vehicle emissions budgets in the SCAG region. I will explain this in greater detail later in my presentation. The second test is the timely implementation of TCM's test. It means that all committed TCMs are required to be given funding priority, are expected to be implemented on schedule, and in the case of any delay, obstacle to implementation has been or is being overcome. And the third test is the fiscal constraint, which requires that reasonable available revenues are identified to cover all transportation project costs. And the last test requires a demonstration of extensive interagency consultation and a public involvement process. Next slide, please. If transportation conformity fails, it can have very serious consequences because it will impact the implementation of a plan and impact the implementation of important transportation projects. For example, under the so-called conformity lapse grace period or conformity freeze, no new project may be added, nor can any significant change be made to existing projects. Under the worst conformity lapse, only exempt projects and approved TCM projects can continue implementation. All the other impact projects can neither receive federal funding, federal approval, or be amended into SCAG's RTP or FTIP. Next slide, please. So those are the general background information. Now let me turn to the transportation control measures or TCMs. So first, what are TCMs? TCMs is actually specifically defined in the Federal Clean Air Act. They are the type of transportation project or programs that reduce vehicle use, change traffic flow or congestion conditions, and have emission reduction benefits. It is important to note that vehicle technology-based, fuel-based, and maintenance-based measures which control the emission from vehicles are not TCMs per the Clean Air Act. SCAG's RTPSS and FTIP include all regionally significant transportation projects in the SCAG region, and the TCMs are a subset of those projects. As you can see from these slides, there are 3 categories of TCM projects. That's the first HOV and HOT or explain projects. The second category is transit and non-motorized or active transportation projects. And the last one is the information-based transportation projects, such as traffic signal synchronization project. As I will explain in the next slides, TCMs are committed through SCAG's FTIP process. Next slide, please. So how are TCMs added and enforced? In the other ozone non-determinant areas outside SCAG region where TCMs required, and TCM are usually a fixed list of projects. However, in the SCAG region, TCM are being added continuously through a rollover process. So specifically, a TCM project is automatically committed if funding is programmed in the first 2 years of right-of-way or construction phase of the project through SCAG's FTIP process. In addition, the implementation of TCM projects is continuously and strictly enforced through SCAG's ongoing TCM timely implementation review and the documentation. As mentioned earlier, SCAG develops RTP-SS every 4 years, FTIP every 2 years, and amend RTP-SS from time to time. and we're required to report on the implementation status and also demonstrate timely implementation in every RTPSS, FTIP, and the RTPSS amendment. And if a TCM delays significantly or cannot move forward, the TCM must be substituted following an extensive process, including interagency consultation, public comment period, SCAG governing board's adoption, and the concurrence by both ERB and the US EPA. Next slide, please. So how strong or robust are TCMs in the South Coast region? For this 2022 AQMP, SCAGs required to, and we have prepared a draft TCM RACO analysis. And that's a draft TCM RACO analysis will be included in SCAG's draft Appendix 4C, which will be transmitted to South Coast AQMD next month for inclusion in the draft AQMP for public review. And the draft TCM RACO analysis demonstrates that all reasonably available TCM are being implemented in the South Coast Air Basin. In addition, as some of you who have been involved in the last 2016 AQMP may recall, SCAG performed a TCM backup analysis for the last 2016 AQMP based on SCAG's previous 2016 RTPSS, and that analysis demonstrates that the best available TCM were implemented in the South Coast Air Basin. Although we're not required to prepare a TCM backup analysis this round, and we have not prepared the analysis for this AQMP, SCAG's last adopt 2020 RTPSS achieved a higher 2030 regional GHG emission reduction target set by CARB than the previous 2016 RTPSS. By strengthening the core strategies in the 2016 RTPSS and also adding new strategies. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that we would continue demonstrate that the best available TCMs are continuing to be implemented in the South Coast Air Basin if we perform such an analysis for this AQMP. Next slide, please. So we continue to implement very strong TCMs in the South Coast Air Basin, but how effective are these TCMs in reducing emissions? And as part of our draft Appendix 4C, we did a rough estimate of the emission reduction benefit from TCMs, as we did for the last 2016 AQMP. I want to know that the estimate is really for illustrative purposes only, because TCM are part of a very complex and interconnected transportation system. It is difficult, if not impossible, to really isolate the effect of TCMs. With that caveat, all the TCM together would yield only about 0.3 or 0.4 tons per day of emission reduction in either ROG or NOx in the year 2035. And in addition, as the vehicles are getting cleaner over time, it's a very moderate emission reduction benefit from TCMs is going to get even smaller. Just for illustration kind of purposes, if all the vehicles are zero emission, TCM would yield zero emission reduction. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of TCMs. Now let me go over how the motor vehicle emission budget are used by SCAG. And as I mentioned earlier, give an overview of how the budgets are used. Also, as I explained in my slide 2, SCAG is required to perform a regional emission test as part of each transportation conformity analysis. The budgets, upon approval or adequacy funding by USEPA are required to use in the regional emission test. So specifically, the emission from SCAG's RTPSS and the FTIP must not exceed all applicable motor vehicle emission budgets for all milestone attainment and the planning horizon years for all applicable criteria pollutants in all non-determinant and maintenance area in the sky region. So I know that's a mouthful, so I will go over one example. Next slide, please. So I know this table has a lot of detail. Hopefully you can see the detail. Actually, this table is from the latest approved SCAG's 2020 RTPSS Amendment number 1. This table shows that the South Coast Air Basin meets the budget test under both the 2008 and the 2015 AR ozone standards. By the way, in the SCAG region, there are a total of 26 non-determinant and maintenance areas. So we have to do the test for all those areas. So I will briefly explain what this table means. The first column, as you can see, lists the 2 precursors of ozone, ROC and NOx. And the second column identify all the values on the right of the table, whether they are budgets, the emission from the plan, and also the difference between these two in the budget and the plan emission. And the third column lists the areas. Please note that Marengo and Pachanga are listed separately, even though they are within the South Coast Air Basin, because they are actually their own separate ozone non-determinant areas. And the first row of the table lists all the years for which our plan needs to meet the budgets. So the first 3 years, 2023, 2026, and 2029 are 3 RFEV budget years for the 2008 AR ozone standards, which is set in the last 2016 AQMP. And 2031 is the attainment year, which also has a budget under the 2008 ozone standard. And 2037 is the attainment year for the 2015 AR ozone standard. At the 2045 is the planning horizon year of SCAG's last 2020 RTPSS. And so now if you look at just the 2023, if you can look at the budget number is 68 tons per day. And if you go down to the plan emissions, the last kind of cell under SCAG, the plan emission is 66. So that leaves the difference of 2, which means that the plan emits 2 tons less than the allowed budget. Same is true for the NOx. If you look at the NOx budget, it's 89 tons per day. If you look at the plan emission, it's 83 tons per day. That leaves a difference of 6 tons. That means the plan emits 6 tons less than the budget allowed. So the same, kind of finding applies to all the remainder years. So that's the. I know this table is pretty complicated. I'll be happy to answer any question. Next slide, I believe this is the last slide, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rongsheng. Appreciate all that. I see Adrian, looks like you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks for that presentation. Really informative. I've got a question on the draft 2022 analysis showing that South Coast is doing all reasonably available TCMs. And I may have missed this, but is that still out for comment?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, as I mentioned, we will transmit the draft dependent policy to AQMD next month to be included for, in the draft AQMP for public review. We are seeking our regional council, our governing board, for approval of the transmittal next week.
Okay, and then it's more a technical question and it doesn't need to be answered right now.
Okay.
I was wondering, section 182E4 of the Clean Air Act has a provision that talks about traffic control measures, and maybe that's different than what you're considering for transportation control measures. And it talks about traffic control measures during heavy pollution hours. And I'm wondering, has there been any consideration, given the deep reductions that we know is needed, the 70%, utilizing that authority, which has been on the books for a long time? Because it seems like that could be something to pursue to help achieve additional reductions in addition to potentially some other transportation control measures.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So as part of our RACO analysis, we did look into, all the, we actually list all the measures by the categories. I think this is one of those categories. So certain things have been implemented in this region. Probably I won't get to the detail because I'm not prepared for presenting that at this meeting. But we did look into that, what's being done in SCAG region. We also look at all the other TCME, other areas, and certainly we will look into further. And by the way, just for your information, all the TCMs are added through SCAG's RTPSS and the FT process. Actually, we're in the process of doing developing first is 2023 FTIP, which is scheduled to be adopted for our board, I think September this year. And we're also in the process developing next 2024 RTPSS, which is scheduled to be adopted by our board in April 2024. So you're highly encouraged and welcome to participate in the process and provide any comments. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for all of the discussion there. Do we have any other comments or questions from the advisory group? Not seeing any hands raised right now. Let's see, are any of the attendees, any questions or comments on this agenda item? Not seeing any. So let's go ahead and keep moving through our agenda. Thanks so much, Rongsheng. So let's move on to an update on the 2022 AQMP control measures. Sang-Mi, if you want to take it away, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Ian. So next item is, as Ian mentioned, that says updates on the 2022 AQMP control measures. Next. So AQMD and CARB jointly hosted a workshop to discuss the control measures to be included in the AQMP. That was November 10 of last year. And then we had 3 kind of general groups of topics addressed during the workshop. One is the South Coast AQMD's stationary resource measures. Second is South Coast AQMD's mobile resource measures. And lastly, CARB's SIP strategy for mostly their mobile sources. There were public comment period opened right after workshop, and then it was closed in December 8 of last year. Next. So far, we received 93 comment letters, and then here are the list of the party entities and public stakeholders who submitted the letters. For example, they are concerned constituents. There are 82 individuals and urging pretty much the same ZE transition heavily. And there was letters from American Coatings Association, Southern California Air Quality Alliance, Roof Coatings Manufacturing Association, Building Decarbonization Coalition, California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance, Regulatory Flexibility Group, Earth Justice, Western State Petroleum Association, Southern California Gas Company, and National Fuel Cell Research Center. All the letters we received are posted on our internet. If you go to AQMP main website, these letters are posted, so available for your review. Next. So these slides and the next 3 slides are summarizing the comments received. Since we received the 93, this is really brief summary of the comments. We tried to group in the 10 categories. So it may not grasp all the entire details of the, or even the exact messages that each letter may intended to convey. That's why the entire letters are posted on the website for your review if you'd like to. So these are again very brief the summary, and then the format that of this slides and next 3 slides are fairly similar. So there are again 10 categories. It's somehow kind of some may call arbitrary, but our best to categorize it to the similar group. And then key comments listed in the center column, and then the entities submitted this comment listed at the last column. So starting from the transition to zero emission and then near zero emission technology, this is a general overall categories. Of course, like any other measures, there are kind of 2 types of the comments. One are mostly proponent kind of urges, and then the other kind of more like raising concerns. But then among them, what we summarize here is first, for the Z and NZ transition wise, there were concerns that there were letters that urges to combine regulatory approach and incentive approach together. And then when we are transitioning to Z technology, its incentive program should be targeted for low income and EJ communities. And then another one is also technical feasibility or use of the national near zero emission fuel cell technology for large turbines. And lastly, there were concerns that there might be increased economic burden, and that might be imposed to lower mid-income or environmental justice communities disproportionately. So next category, the incentive. So there are a kind of some comments may be overlapping, so it might be repeated a little bit. But anyway, when incentive comes, here again urges that all the existing incentive program targeting to Z instead of NZ. And also when it comes to incentive, it should be focusing on the lower income communities. And then also one more comment was urges not entirely relying on incentive program. In other words, it is combining regulatory and incentive approach together. Next slide. So here, this first category is Z and Z for stationary sources. So when it comes to stationary sources, the comments was slightly different, but still what it was, the most of the comment were Z kind of agrees or urges Z transition of Z technology for residential, commercial, or even large combustion equipment. But it also saying that some letters also saying some concerns, specifically for the facilities who were subject to the recent rulemaking the South Coast AQMD adopted. For example, there was 1109.1 refineries are subject to whether stringent emission reductions, and then also other facilities subject to recent rulemaking that requires BART level controls to install or to install. So the concern is for those recently replaced, recently installed or to install equipments could get stranded if there is abrupt transition to Z technology. And also some concerns is about technical feasibility, especially for large turbines, and technical feasibility and availabilities. Next category is buildings. And then buildings, generally, there are so many comment letters. The first concerned citizen, 82 comment letters specifically urging the transition to Z technology for building categories. And then also it urged the regulatory bodies greater commitment for solar energy in these specific sectors. And then also it urges targeted incentives for low income and environmental EJ communities. But then there were also concerns that similar to the previously mentioned, the concerns that there would be increased cost, and the cost would that increased cost affect low and middle income families disproportionately. Next slide. So there was also concerns raised about the emergency generator or emergency backup generators. So here the concern is if there is the industry-wide and society-wide transition to Z technology, that means increased electricity use, and that increased electricity use might increase the use of emergency backup generator, and then increased use of a backup generator would consequently increase the emissions. So that was the one concern raised. And also at the same time, when there is the increased electricity, that might increase the net cost for utility, and that will affect disproportionately low-income communities. On the other hand, some comments were allowing non-Z technologies for emergency engines, and also raised the concerns about the public safety, feasibility, and then availability of a certain technology type. Next category is infrastructure. No, thank you. Next category is infrastructure. So infrastructure main concern is resilience of electrical grid. Increased electricity demand means there is increased supply. So whether current electrical grid is resilient enough to accommodate the increased demand. And some raised kind of recommendation that this transition to ZE from the fossil fuel economy needs to take over time, so it can prepare communities and industries to the new paradigm gradually. And then another one is also there is renewable portfolio for electric grid, and then there is already big challenges for it to meet the California GHG goal. So to consider that the challenges the industry faces. And then similarly, in infrastructure-wise, there might be a special permission to be given to the use of dispatchable electric generators. So the next category is VOC measures. And then the comments were that the urges to pursue more reductions from refinery sectors. And then also there were concerns in removing PCBTF and TBAC from the list of exempt material. Also, there was concerns regarding incentivizing UV electron beam and LED technology due to the cost and feasibility and safety issues. And then also there is a concern about efficacy of FUZ-01 control measure. This control measure is targeting the detection of the leak and the repair. If there is any fugitive emission or leak, that this measure is targeting to detect it and repair that fugitive leak. Next slide. So the next category is transportation or mobile source control measures. So the comments were additional measures are needed to pursue emission reductions through the tools such as motor vehicle emissions budget or TCMs. And then these two topics as discussed in previous two presentation. So there was a comment to pursue further reductions through those mechanisms. And also there was an urge to pursue emission reductions from commercial poles. And also there was comments to urge adopt ISR indirect source rule approaches for rail yards and new development and redevelopment and other related mobile sources. And then there was urge to adopt more aggressive fleet rules, the South Coast AQMD's fleet rules. Next item is utilization of Clean Air Act, Section 182E5 measures. It is so-called black box measures. So Clean Air Act allows for extreme non-attainment area to rely on further development of a cleaner technology that's still not available at the time of planned development. And then this comment letter has raised the concern on relying on 182E5 measures. Lastly, there was an urge to pursue fair share emission reductions, both the EPA controlled sources and carbon controlled sources and AQMD controlled sources. Next slide. So this was a brief summary of the comments we received after the control measure workshop. And then this slide summarizes the steps we are taking for the next stage. First step, incorporating the comments received from the public stakeholders. And second, we are still developing control measures to demonstrate attainment. And third, continuing control working group meetings. I think Ian mentioned in previous, in response to previous comments, we have the zero emission infrastructure working group meeting scheduled next Friday, a week from today. And then we plan to release the draft control measures in advance to the releasing the entire AQMP document. This is to accommodate more public comment for control measures, given that majority of public comments were received on the control measure itself, judging from the previous AQMP experiences. And then it follows by, of course, release of AQMP. So this summarizes my presentation, and we can open up for comments and questions from our advisory group members and public.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Sang-Mi. Just a quick reminder for folks too, our website, we did include the comment letters that we've received that Sang-Mi just walked through. Those are on the AQMD website for the air quality management plan, the AQMP. So if you could scroll down just below where the control measure workshop materials are, you'll find the comment letters there. And so with that, would like to see, are there any questions or comments? Looks like we do have a hand raised from the advisory group. Lakshmi, go ahead.
I'm wearing my Future Ports hat now, not SoCal Gas. My question was on the last slide that Sang-Mi Lee had, where she said you're going to release the control measures ahead of the draft AQMP. If I recall correctly, sort of from an earlier conversation during this meeting, you were saying you were expecting to release the draft AQMP sometime in March. So there's no timeline over here. So I was just wondering when you expect to release the control measures.
Ian, do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the timeline is still what we are working on, or the step we were actually working on to make this release on time. So this is still preliminary, so subject to change. I gotta put this disclaimer first. But then the main draft AQMP, we are targeting March. We are hoping earlier March if possible, maybe mid-March if possible. But then control measures, we'd like to release at least a 2-week advance of the main draft AQMP. So if feasible, end of February, but if there is more more work needs to be done, could be maybe 1 week delay possible, but then still we try to release it in by end of February if that is possible. So that's control measure schedule. And then draft AQMP is a couple of weeks after that.
Okay, and then would you also be releasing sort of the inventory along with the control measures?
Yes, so first, the baseline inventory for the base year and the future years are already on our website, AQMP website, per the stakeholders' request from the control measure workshop. But that's a major source category level, fairly detailed inventory. But then when we are releasing the AQMP, we plan to release the Appendix 3. Typically, that is detailed emission inventory chapter. It describes the methodologies and then the categories that has gone through major updates since last AQMP, and then also major source level inventory for the milestone years. So those are still planned to release in March timeframe, but quick question to you is yes.
Okay, so that is sort of like the baseline future, right? So when you release the draft control measures, would you also be releasing sort of your expected emission reductions for each control measure along with that? That's sort of where my question was.
That each control measure has expected emission reduction. So that is part of the standard write-up.
Okay, okay, thank you.
I'll just throw a caveat because, and before pre-draft, there's always a million caveats before the real draft. There are some control measures, of course, that don't have any emission reductions, that, education outreach kind of things, but some control measures too that there might be a TBD just because of the nature of the control measure. But everywhere that we can put it, we'll make sure to put it, and that's draft, right, on all of those.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Sure, good question. Looks like the next hand I see, Janet. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you, Ian. And so I want to reflect back on the prior discussion about economic feasibility evaluations or cost effectiveness, whichever way you want to look at it. And I think that this is, kind of blending what both Mark and Francis had pointed out before, especially with the zero emission strategies and proposed control measures. It's almost like a whole new framework that needs to be developed because the infrastructure components of the measures are so uncertain and future oriented. It's hard to understand then how to approach some of the feasibility analyses, including, I would say, the technology side, but just kind of focusing on the economic for now. So I think my question then is, where do we have the discussion with you all to understand possible approaches to doing the economic analysis, and then what is actually going to be applied into the AQMP?
Yeah, that's a good question. So then when thinking through the economic analysis, we do have our STMPR advisory group that we do go through a little bit more detail on that economic analysis as part of that advisory group. But I think the question you're maybe getting at is a little bit some of the discussion that we had earlier about the last AQMP, and that, some numerical threshold above which, a more robust analysis of economic feasibility would take place, and how would that work at a high level. It seems that that's worth bringing up here with this group. I don't know that we're quite ready to have that conversation here at this group. Maybe that's something we can bring back as part of a future agenda topic. Some of that I think could be specified here in this AQMP, but you're correct that there are some measures where there is going to be uncertainty in this AQMP because the technologies we aren't entirely sure just yet. And so we are going to have to evaluate that in the future, but we can set up how we're going to do that as part of this AQMP. So I think we can try to create some space at a future working group meeting or advisory group meeting to talk through that.
And it might need to be staged a little bit. If there's the zero emission work group, some of that discussion can probably inform then how you might approach the analysis. And I'm taking it that there'll be some done immediately for the AQMP purposes, and others will be later when you do the technology feasibility assessments that are part and parcel of the control measures. So yeah, thank you for that, and just did want to flag it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good question. Let's see, David Rothbard, looks like you have your hand raised.
Good morning, David Rothbard, representing the Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works. And apologize for not sending a letter in, but essentially what we're struggling with is, as essential public service operating wastewater treatment plants, we take society's waste. When you flush your toilet, it goes to the treatment plant, it generates a renewable non-fossil fuel. And at the moment with the electrification focus, we're kind of trying to figure out where to go with this. And the other element that makes this challenging is SB 1383 says, take food waste out of landfills to reduce methane emissions. And that food waste, honestly, is going to have to go to a wastewater treatment plant. So we're going to generate more biogas. So we're trying to figure out where this gas could go. There's NSR issues as far as permitting new sources within South Coast. and CARB is essentially saying, don't put it in vehicle fuels. So we're kind of hitting a dead end as far as what to do with this gas. And really would appreciate sitting down with you to figure out how we could move forward while still providing a reliable essential public service. So I don't know if this is a separate discussion, but we certainly would appreciate having some high-level discussions on how we could proceed and help with emission reductions in the region as well. So just wanted to bring that up as a concern we're having.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for your comments. Yeah, we certainly can have a follow-up meeting and have a discussion.
I think part of that too is, there's, control measures that AQMD will be taking the lead on, but then there's certainly also the CARB measures, and what they're doing on their zero emission rules for fleets, such as the ones that you're talking about. So I think that there's, multiple conversations that would need to be had on this, but you raise a good point.
Talking to CARB as well to try to find a path forward, but honestly, not really finding the solutions at the moment. So I think having discussions with you and maybe having CARB and Cal Recycle and CAPCOA sit down as well. I think this really is a statewide issue. And to the point where my coalition statewide is even thinking we might need to get higher level folks and even the governor's office to bring up this issue as far as what to do with essential public services moving forward. But I appreciate the feedback, and to the extent we could all work together, we'd appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, thanks for raising that. Okay. I see Adrian Martinez, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the prior comments. On the infrastructure discussion, I think one of the things I hope that's part of the discussion on cost effectiveness and kind of the challenges to moving to zero emissions across sectors, which the staff identified as the only kind of feasible path to get to the 70% reductions to achieve the 2015 ozone standard. I think it's important also to kind of understand the benefits. I think oftentimes these discussions on costs and impacts, they focus on the fuel switching as hurting certain types of industries, but we understand that there are benefits, their job creation, given the amount of infrastructure and other kind of new strategies that are needed. Prime example, 1109.1. There was a lot of clamoring on costs and impacts throughout that process, but in the end, we found out that it would create thousands of jobs each year, in addition to providing immense emissions reduction benefits. So I hope that staff is going to take that more holistic view. There's a lot of benefits to advancing zero emission solutions. And I think there's a growing recognition in the economics community and all sorts of communities that this is kind of a more complex economic outlook than some of the analysis that has been done previously in prior air plans. So I think those discussions, I was under the impression that they were in that zero emission or the infrastructure working group. If they are going to take place in other venues, I think it'd be great to let the committee know, because I think we're definitely going to want to participate. And I assume there are a lot of other groups that will want to participate, because I think it's a bigger discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, to your point about it being a bigger discussion, there certainly are, there are multiple groups throughout the state right now talking about zero emissions, whether it's individual rules at CARB or larger infrastructure issues, with the Energy Commission working on it, Public Utilities Commission working on it, CARB working on it, GOBEZ working on it. We teed some of that up in our last working group meeting for zero emission infrastructure. We're doing our focus on it as well. So there is definitely a lot to track. I think we can keep trying to advertise to the right parties. If you think there's additional people we need to reach out to specifically, definitely reach out to us and let us know, so that we can be making sure to include everybody that would want to be included in our discussions on this. Yeah, I think you raised some of the issues that we're trying to explore as part of this AQMP. So I appreciate that. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised from the advisory group. Let's see, I don't see any hands raised also from the attendees. So with that, let's go on to the next agenda item. And so this is just a short item. So every AQMP cycle, we have a health effects chapter, or rather health effects appendix, and an analysis of the health effects of air pollution in particular, for example, on particulate matter. And as part of that preparation of that review of health effects, that is reviewed by the district advisory council. That advisory council is made up of members of a variety of different advisory groups, so including the AQMP advisory group and other advisory groups that we have. We ask those advisory groups to nominate or have volunteers to sit on the advisory council itself. So we would ask the advisory group here, the AQMP advisory group, if you would nominate a person or have one person volunteer to sit on that advisory council. We would appreciate it. That advisory council typically meets once. There's a chance it might meet twice to discuss this health effects study that's included as part of an appendix to the AQMP. That would be coming up in several months. So I want to open this up now and see if there are any advisory group members who would like to volunteer or nominate somebody to sit on the advisory council. And if people want to sit and think about it, that's okay too. But I see a flurry of hands. Everybody's just eager to go take on new challenges. But we will ask, and we will likely follow up with an email to this advisory group asking again if you want to volunteer yourself or nominate somebody to sit on the advisory council. That would be great if somebody would like to do that. Okay. So I don't see any hands raised for discussion on this topic from the panelists. I don't see any hands raised from attendees on this agenda item. So we will move on to the next agenda item, other business. So is there any other business from any member of the advisory group that you would like to raise at this time? Not seeing any. So then finally for public comment, is there any public comment on any item concerning this group that we have not already covered earlier in the agenda? So any public comment? Not hearing any. All right, so we've had a good, robust discussion today. Really appreciate everybody's participation and sharing their thoughts, joining us this morning. Thank you all to staff who's done a lot of work to get to this point. Still definitely more work to go, but we look forward to continuing these conversations with you all. We do hope to have another meeting in March this year. We haven't set the specific date yet, but we will certainly be reaching out to get this on everyone's calendar to continue along in this conversation. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you all have a great morning. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.